With rare access and unflinching restraint, the documentary The Alabama Solution exposes the human cost of confinement in stark, at times difficult to watch detail. The film sets out and succeeds in offering a view of a mass incarceration system laid bare. If what we see is functioning as designed, should it be allowed to continue? Hello and welcome to USA Today's The Excerpt. I'm Dana Taylor. The Alabama Solution was directed and produced by Andrew Jarecki and Charlotte Kaufman and co-produced by Alex Duran, program director at Galaxy Gives, an organization committed to criminal justice reform. The film has been nominated for Best Documentary at this year's Academy Awards. Andrew and Alex, thank you so much for joining me to discuss the film.
Yeah, thank you for having us, sir.
Yeah, thank you for having us, Dana.
Andrew, I want to try to get a sense of the scale. In 2020, the Department of Justice sued the Alabama Department of Corrections for unconstitutional conditions in men's prisons. Where does that case stand, and what can you share regarding the number of lives lost?
Well, we started working on this film 7 years ago and have been tracking every death in the system, which is critical because the Department of Corrections doesn't do that. Great, amazing. If you can't measure it, you can't fix it. And I think their attitude is, we don't really even want to know how bad this is. So there have been 1,500 people that have died in the system since we started working on the film. And those people are dying from drug overdoses. The drugs are primarily brought in by officers, sold by officers. And they're dying from medical neglect. They're dying from being killed by officers, which is something you see in our film. So the problem is very, very significant, and Alabama doesn't seem to want to address it. And so when the DOJ came in and said, we have done this big investigation into your prison system, which lasted a few years, and we are clear that your constitutional protections have been ignored, you've got all kinds of cruel and unusual punishment happening here. Alabama's response was to say, well, that's just anecdotal. That's really not true. We don't agree with your, work. You didn't investigate properly. And therefore, they refused to make any changes. They refused to even undertake a consent decree. And instead, they went to court, decided to fight it. And now that's been underway for a number of years. And it doesn't seem like there's any hope that it's going to end soon.
The internal workings of U.S. incarceration systems are rarely seen. Andrew, your film centers the voices of the incarcerated. For those who've not yet seen the film, how did you obtain the footage used in the film?
The first time that we went into an Alabama prison, and it was sort of the only time that we ever did with a camera, it was by coincidence, sort of miraculous, that they allowed us to do it at all. And it was because we went in to film a revival meeting, kind of a religious day where they were doing a barbecue, and that's a pretty unusual situation anyway. But while we were there, men started taking us aside and saying there are terrible things happening inside the prisons that they're not letting you see. That building over there is where they've got people in solitary confinement, sometimes for 5 years at a time. That building over there is the behavior modification unit where the guards have killed men. And they were so disturbed, and the situation was so dire that they asked us if we would be able to get the word out for them. And then we discovered that there was this network of leaders inside who had been organizing nonviolent protests for years, who were incredibly knowledgeable about the system and had access to contraband cell phones. And so we were in a position to have them tell their own story, which is why the film is so different than if you see some episode of some prison show on television where it's obviously all curated by the administration.
That was one aspect that I was really fascinated by, those contraband cell phones. They were able to capture their stories and share them. They could have shared those stories with anyone. They could have shared that video with anyone, but they trusted you to share their story in full.
Alex has gotten to know the men very well, as I have. I'm curious, Alex, why do you feel like there was that level of trust?
For so many currently and formerly incarcerated people, this story hasn't gotten out. And we've been trying to tell this story for a very long time. But I think there is a high level of trust placed on us, and then telling the story with a lot of integrity, and making sure that it's not going to be kind of placated. One of the things that I always say is that the d- just the brilliance and the bravery and the beauty of incarcerated people is not seen because prison just operates, as Andrew always says, as black sites in the in this country, and the Supreme Court has deemed okay to prevent journalists from going into prisons. When we met the men, they wanted to. And by the way, they have been telling this story on like putting YouTube videos out into other social media for a long time. We just had kind of like the infrastructure to turn it into a feature film. And the fact that I was formerly incarcerated kind of provided, I think, a level of trust there too as well.
There are moments in the film that are graphic and deeply disturbing, and I imagine that you went through hours of footage where there were complete storylines of other prisoners that didn't make it into the film. So how did you come to shape the narrative for this film?
Well, it was definitely an evolution. We usually start editing a film very early in the process. For example, there were some incredibly compelling stories about other people who had been killed by officers, other people who had been sucked into the system in some terrible way. But the reason that we focused on Stephen Davis, the young man who's beaten to death by this corrections officer, Rod Gadsden, is that it was integrated into the story in a way that would allow the audience to follow it. We knew that Melvin Ray and Robert Earl Counsel were going to be critical figures in the film. And one day, Melvin texted us to say somebody's been beaten at Donaldson Prison and they're in the hospital in Birmingham. And Charlotte and I got in a car and drove to the hospital and went up there, and you see the footage of us. We just took our iPhones out and walked up to the room, and we found that Stephen Davis had died. The fact that we had learned that from one of the other main characters in the film gave us the opportunity to integrate it so that the audience could follow along.
Alex is someone who survived incarceration, who now funds efforts to dismantle its harms. What are your thoughts specifically on the cycle of violence that exists within mass incarceration?
I would say the main perpetrator of that violence is the state, and the fact that they're allowing it to happen. Uh, as Andrew noted recently, Alabama Department of Corrections, they're aware of this. They know that this is happening under watch, with taxpayers' dollars, and allowing this to happen. And it doesn't have to be this way, right? We visit states like Maine, where the commissioner there, Randy Liberty, has actually built a humane system. So, there are other places and jurisdictions that made different choices.
Alex, there was a corrections officer in the film. He may have been a former corrections officer who said, "You want to hire people who will do the right thing when no one is watching." I know that in your work, you're dedicated to transforming conditions of confinement. What do you see as a necessary first step? What's happening in Maine where they're getting it right?
I think it starts from the top and the leadership. Also, the right training for these officers, investing in education for people who are incarcerated, investing in healing, investing in actually rehabilitating folks. And also, we're incarcerating too many people for far too long. I've go into prisons all the time, and one of the first the things that I hear, the recurring theme, is that you ask an officer in any prison, how many people would you, if you have the power to release, that you will let them go, and you know that they won't come back to prison. Usually, half of the people there, they will tell you, we just incarcerate, there's too many people.
One of the things that you see in a state like Maine is just a very consistent effort to try to train people to have skills that they can use when they leave, because 95% of the people who are incarcerated are coming out again. right? And traumatizing people who are in your care is not a good way to have them go out and rejoin society, become taxpayers.
Andrew, were there perspectives that you struggled to include, such as those from policymakers or other prison staff? You included sound bites of Alabamans saying, basically, it's prison. It's supposed to be awful. How did you navigate these competing narratives about justice?
You want to balance it, right? You don't want to have a film that just says everybody's awful all the time. And so, for example, those two corrections officers, Quante Cockrell and Stacey George, are two people who left the system because they were so disturbed by what they were being asked to do. So here you have two people who are really humane, decent people who were functioning as corrections officers. If we just painted everybody with the same brush, people would say, all right, well, I guess people are just awful to people and there's nothing else you could do about it. We're all barbarians. But the reality is we're not barbarians. We're, for the most part, people want to be decent to each other. And you end up in these prison systems recruiting and rewarding the most brutal guards because it's somehow easier for the state to just lock people away and assume that we're never going to hear from them again. And the most brutal guards are the ones who are the best enforcers of these terrible conditions. So you have people like Rod Gadsden. I'm sure Rod Gadsden was a sweet kid, but being able to stand in front of 70 people in the dorm and beat somebody to death, that's a perversion of human nature that happens as a result of the environment.
This is a system that's not keeping anybody safe, both officers and incarcerated people alike. I would see throughout my time incarcerated an officer come in on his first day on the job, trying to do a good job and trying to be a decent human being. And you could see his humanity eroded day by day by this system, right? That's why we need to transform this whole system, because it's actually leading to the harm of so many people who actually work there, not only the incarcerated people.
And we should say that Gadsden was not found guilty or, I believe, even charged. He's been promoted twice since the death.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess we're careful to say, I try to avoid the phrase murderer because it's, I think, undisputed that he killed somebody with his own hands. But, in the system, there are a lot of protections for that. You can say, well, he was doing his job, or you can say, oh, well, he was being attacked, which appears to be totally false. But that's the idea. And that's one of the most unusual things in the film is that there's a deposition with Rod Gadsden, the person who killed Stephen Davis. And he is explaining himself and the level of, it's almost like he's indignant that anybody would hold him responsible for that. At one point, the lawyer asks him, well, you've got over 20 cases against you for brutality. He says, oh, those are just allegations. And he says, well, what about these detailed responses, about what about the fact that you're kicking and punching and hitting this person with a shield, and that this, it's quite chilling description of what has happened to the people in his care. And he just sort of dismisses it. And they say, well, have you settled those cases? I don't know. I don't know which one of those cases have been settled. So he's so divorced from any kind of accountability that he's almost indignant that anybody would even question that. Like, he's allowed to do what he wants. And he can't believe that somebody's even calling him or trying to hold him to account for it, because he's never been held to account for anything that he's done.
I'll ask this question of both of you, starting with you, Alex. The film exists within a broader national conversation about incarceration. After audiences watch The Alabama Solution, what do you hope lingers and what has stayed with you?
I want Americans to think about how do you want your own neighbor to return after being incarcerated? What do you want that person who's living next to you to have experienced? Certainly not what we have seen in the documentary, The Alabama Solution. Because just think about the level of trauma that one is going. Just imagine some 22-year-old who gets caught with drug possession, goes into Alabama prison, is brutally raped and allowed to be by the system, and then gets released 7, 8, 9 years later. Like, how is that person going to ever actually healed from that experience? That's why people are committing suicide at a high rate. That's why people are just doing drugs at a high rate. And that level of trauma and violence is just going to continue if we are not building a system or dismantling a system that's not keeping us safe. And I want people to walk away with that and take action.
We're seeing a lot of people who are going to the website, which is the alabamasolution.com, and just clicking to sort of take action. And, we're not asking them to donate money or to do something that's going to have to change their career. We're just saying, call these institutions and say, keep these men safe. Here's a phone number to call. Here's a way to send a letter to the governor's office. The public reaction, the public outcry really, really makes a big difference. There's a fear, I think, that getting involved is either going to be more than you can handle as an individual, or it's not going to make a difference. And the reality is you can do small things. You can ask your legislators questions. You can go to a town meeting and ask somebody what's going on in your local prison. And all you're really doing is being a concerned citizen just by being insistent that we treat people in these institutions in a humane way. You actually do have the ability to make a big difference.
Andrew and Alex, thank you so much for joining me on the excerpt.
Thank you for having us.
These are such thoughtful questions. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. I'm Dana Taylor. I'll see you next time.